So to start off the talk, first of all, let's talk briefly about what is a sandbox, right? So fundamentally, a sandbox is an untrusted environment which is designed to kind of contain untrusted content. It's an environment which is designed to contain and ensure that you can have malicious code or exploits, and all of that is contained within that environment. It doesn't leak onto the host, right? And the idea is that you can't detect enough malware or malicious stuff, so you create these containers where you can isolate them and hopefully contain them long enough. So for this talk, we'll actually focus on Windows-based application sandboxes. And in this talk, we are not finding out vulnerabilities in the sandbox implementations. Rather, what we are pointing out are rather fundamental and architectural limitations of sandboxes, what we encounter in our research. And we kind of mostly talk about the limitations in general in terms of from a security standpoint. So for the sake of this talk, we have divided sandboxes into two types. Type 1 is the OS enhancement based sandbox, which includes sandboxes like Sandboxy, Buffer Zone Pro. So these have been there for a while, and they're quite popular as well, along with malware research teams and pros. And then the second type is the master-slave model, which includes sandboxes like Adobe Reader X and the famous Google Chrome browser. There's a type 3, which we have not really discussed here, but I'll probably briefly talk about it at the end of the discussion. So before we go into sandboxes, there is some amount of details on Windows OS internals, right? So as we all know, Windows is divided into two main components. One is the user mode and the other is the kernel mode. And unknown to the average user, every time you, for example, interact with, say, a font file in a Word document, you are actually making a lot of kernel component accesses unknown to the user. So fundamentally, what I'm trying to say is that there's a large exposure to kernel interfaces in our day-to-day lives when we use simple applications like internet browsers, Word documents, and so on. And that is kind of the attack surface which we are going to be focusing on today. So let's look at the state of kernel security on Windows operating system today. So it's well known that it's non-trivial to exploit a kernel mode vulnerability reliably, and then there's a fact that there haven't been too much of kernel mode malware found or discovered in the wild, but things have changed in the past few years. For instance, just in 2012, there were 25 CVE items which were actually Windows kernel patches from Microsoft. Just last month, there were 30 CVE items in Win32k.sys, which is a very critical kernel component in the operating system. And so our question is, to what degree can a sandbox limit the exposure to kernel interfaces, given that, yes, it is not as trivial to exploit and reliably exploit kernel vulnerabilities. So and there have been cases of real targeted malware like the DoQ bug, which was exploited not too long back, which was also actually exploiting a Windows kernel vulnerability. So how does it work, right, inside a sandbox? This is how it looks like. So in terms of enforcing the sandbox application will say, dear kernel, please open a file for me, and the file name is at address X, and the kernel points to allowed file.txt, and then it says, okay, here is the handle, right? And then the sandbox says, dear kernel, please open a file for me, and the file is at address Y, and kernel says, okay, here is this file is a secret.txt file, and since you are a sandbox application, I will not let you access the file. So this is how a typical sandbox interacts with the kernel to make decisions, right? So now, say for example, I have a kernel exploit. How it would work, right? So the sandbox app says, dear kernel, please draw the text hello world for me using the Truetype font stored at address X. And the kernel says, you are a sandbox application, but using a font is a benign operation, and which you need to do to function properly. So what I'll do is I will give you handle, but let me parse this font first, right? And while processing the font, the kernel corrupts its own memory because the parser code was buggy. And because of the memory corruption, the kernel starts executing code at X, which allows the application to do anything it wants because it has the same privilege as that of the kernel at this point, right? So this is like a high-level view of how pretty much every sandbox works and how it interacts with the kernel, right? So let's talk about the type 1, which is the OS enhancement-based sandbox. So in this case, we took Sandboxes, which is a very popular application. As you can see, there have been several downloads, several people have passed reviews, and a lot of people use it for malware analysis and so on. So how it works is it's a custom kernel driver which modifies the Windows behavior to change and ensure that certain parts of the protected system within the sandbox context are protected. And the use case is, you can run arbitrarily EXEs, you can run your browser, you can use Internet Explorer, Firefox inside Sandboxes. And the idea is that it should be able to contain the exploits and the malware within the sandbox. So we got this diagram from actually the public sources. It's not an official sandboxing material, but this is how it looks at a very high level. Like the Sandboxes driver basically intercepts and makes a decision whether it should allow an activity or not. So the problem is that the sandbox code has direct access to pretty much all OS functionality, which kind of could mean that if the sandbox is compromised, you can steal data and so on. And the biggest drawback is that almost all kernel vulnerabilities can be exploitable from within this sandbox. And this sandbox has no means to contain the malicious code, simply because they are running at the same privilege level. So having said that, I'll hand over to Rafal to run the roulette and see how we can bypass Sandboxes.
Thank you. So it's my turn to press the page down key, and you see the roulette spinning. Hooray! So the first vulnerability we'll talk about today is patched in Microsoft Bulletin 1242 about a year ago, a little bit less, and was titled User Mode Scheduler Memory Corruption, which is totally misleading, but it's the way Microsoft titles their bulletins. And the root cause of the vulnerability was a bug in the kernel code responsible for returning to user mode from a system call. So it was in the core of the operating system. And more details are not necessary. The point is that this vulnerability allows to run arbitrary code in kernel mode, even if the exploit is run by an unprivileged process, for instance, in this case, a sandbox process. So if we try to run this exploit in a sandbox environment, we'll see it just works. You can take a public exploit for this vulnerability, which is published in many places like Packet Storm or whatever, and this exploit will work just fine. You will get kernel code execution, but at which stage the game is over, basically, right? Because untrusted code gained code execution in the kernel mode. The tiny catch, or the tiny detail, is what to do with this unlimited power that kernel mode execution gives you. Because again, normally exploits like this published exploit, all they do is grant the caller, the user mode process, the highest possible privilege. So the system level privilege. It's named token stealing. So you steal the access token from the system process, assign it to the current process, and then magically the current process has system privileges. So if you do exactly that, and the public exploit does exactly that, it succeeds. So if you run the exploit in Sandboxing, you get a system shell. But the fun part is that this system shell is still contained by Sandboxing. It still cannot do anything, really. Although being the system shell, if you type who am I, you get anti-authority system. Still you cannot do overwrite any system files, you cannot terminate processes, because Sandboxing is parallel, or rather serial, to the protection enforced by the kernel. So even if it's a system process, it's still enforced. So what we need to do is to use again this unlimited power of the kernel mode to do something else. First of all, we can disable Sandboxing driver completely. Because again, we are in kernel mode, we can uninstall all the hooks, we can even override the body of the Sandboxing driver, we can do anything. But for that, we would need to figure out the exact details how Sandboxing operates, and besides being a bit lazy, it's not necessary. There's a better approach, more generic one. We can migrate to another process, inject code to another process that is not subject to Sandboxing protection. So any process that runs outside of the sandbox. Again, we can do it because while we are in kernel mode, we can overwrite any memory, modify any kernel structures, etc., etc. So particularly, it's doable to inject code into arbitrary process. And that migration trick is the tiny required part to fully bypass the Sandboxing, as we will see in a moment. Yeah. So one remark: in all the demos that we will see, all these sandboxes are run on unpatched Windows 7 Service Pack 1. So we don't have any Windows kernel 0 days. We have to use exploit for an old vulnerabilities, and that's why we run it on old version of Windows. Again, if someone finds a 0 day, he can use the exact same mechanism. Just for illustration purposes, we chose well-known exploits and vulnerabilities. But on the other hand, all of the sandboxes are the latest version, or they were at the time when we did the research. So we're not exploiting a bug in Sandboxing implementation itself, right? It's not that we found a bug in an old version of Sandbox and now we are exploiting. No, we are exploiting the inherent weakness that the Sandbox is reliant on the integrity of the operating system. Okay, so let's see how it goes. So this is the way how you can run arbitrary command in a Sandboxing shell. So just run cmd-exe to make it most convenient. And now let's see that it's Sandbox. Well, there is some visual indicator. You see when you move mouse cursor over the title bar, you see this yellow frame. So it's supposed to be Sandbox. So if I do, for instance, try to shadow the machine, it's denied, and even I get a message from Sandboxing that Sandboxed application tried to do something nasty, right? So that's nice. Other thing that we can try is to start Notepad. So it's another application. It's not Sandboxed. And let's see if we can. And both cmd-exe and Notepad runs as the same user, right? And let's see what happens if you try to terminate this Notepad process. So Notepad is 596. So if you try to terminate it, again you get access denied. So that should convince you that indeed this shell runs protected, or rather confined by the Sandboxing, and it cannot do anything that would damage the rest of the system. Okay, so what happens when we run the exploit? This exploit again is a bit non-trivial because it consists of two stages. First, you get to run arbitrary code in kernel mode, and then you have to inject code into another process that is not Sandbox, right? I mentioned it already. So the first thing you do, you have to find some non-sandbox process which we can inject code to. We can use this notepad process, but it's more generic to use the winInit process with some nice properties. Okay, so winIt is 360, and now let's see what ports are open in this process. Okay, so winInit is bit 360, and it has open one port for it, probably from some RPC service, and it happens to run a system, and it runs outside of the sandbox. So now we just run the exploit. It might require full path though. Yeah, no crash, so it seems to work. Now what we have to do is to wake up this process. So we connect to this open port with netcat, and it is only required to wake up this process, because how this code injection works, then when the process wakes up, then the code gets injected. So that's why we have to wake it by connecting to this port. And now let's see what ports are open in this winInit process. You can see there is one more, 44444, and if you have ever used Metasploit, you probably already expected that this is a usual bind shell by Metasploit. So if you connect to it, you are greeted by the usual NT030 system shell. Again, the point is that this shell is exposed by the winInit process that is not sandboxed, right? And to convince you that it's not sandboxed, we will try to kill notepad. Where is it? Here. So this time let's try to kill this notepad from this shell, and you see this time it worked. So really we are running outside of the sandboxing protection. So again, that demonstrates the full compromise of the sandbox model, not because of the bug in the sandbox implementation itself, but because of the bug in the underlying operating system. We started in an unprivileged shell confined by the sandbox, and then by exploiting a vulnerability in the operating system, we are able to control arbitrary process that does not run as sandbox. So again, it means the complete bypass of the security implemented by the sandbox.
You want to stay here? Yeah. Okay, that was the first bypass. So
and you need to release the focus.
Yeah.
It's crappy, I know.
You change the keys. You can probably stay here for the yeah. So the next this was the first sandbox bypass. So the next one is we are using a similar sandbox called Buffer Zone Pro. This is also another bypass and another commonly used sandbox available commercially. Why we choose Buffer Zone Pro is not because it's significantly interesting, but mainly to prove a point that the first exploit was a generic architectural limitation and not a sandboxy specific. So what we do is that we use the same exploit and then we try to bypass Buffer Zone Pro with the systhread exploit. So we have a demo for that as well.
So to be honest, it won't be anything new. I've already seen almost all of it. The only difference is Buffer Zone works a little bit differently. So what we can do is open Windows Explorer, Documents. Okay. So you see, we have a secret file named secret file in the Documents folder If you just open it, there's a message, this is a secret file, right? Now what we can do, we'll do the very similar thing. Run cmd.exe shell in a sandbox environment, but this time it will be a buffer zone. So you do open inside buffer zone. Yes. Okay, let's close it. Okay, you see even cmd.exe cannot find all the system messages. It's really sandbox. And if you do, for instance, start seeing, then if you navigate to the documents folder, documents, here it is. You see, there are no remarks about the secret file. This file is hidden from the sandbox process by the operating system. So there is no way sandbox process should be able to get contents of this file. Again, assuming the kernel works properly. And what we will do, we'll just run exactly the same steps as before. You will see it's exactly the same. So get the PID. The only difference is you have to use start task manager, I think, to get the PID of WinInit process. Whatever. So WinInit is 372 on the system. And get the listening port. It happens to be the same port. Now run the exploit. 372. Wake up the WinInit process. 9152. And it's all we need. Again, now we can have a look again. This WinInit process has been injected with shellcode. It has opened a listening port for us. So again, we can connect to this port. Again, this is highest privileged user mode process that you can imagine. And again, it runs outside of Sandbox. Yeah, you can see, this time we can see this file in the listing. You can also type the contents. So obviously this process runs outside of the sandbox. So again, full bypass of the security promise implemented in the sandbox, right? We started in an unprivileged, fully contained shell contained by the sandbox, and then we end up with a system level process running outside of the sandbox.
Okay, great. So now that we have completely compromised the type 1 sandboxes, we'll go for the more interesting and the far more prevalent ones, which is the type 2. So type 2 sandboxes typically have two processes, and we are calling it the master and the slave, and they interact over an IPC channel, and the slave is confined using OS operating system access control facilities, and the master mediates the access to the resources. And the best examples for of this type are the Google Chrome browser and Adobe Reader, the Sandbox Reader version. And if you look at it, the high-level architecture from the Chromium resources, this is how the IPC interactions happens between the master and the slave. So the Chromium Sandbox runs with low privileges, which is obviously controlled by the operating system, which means that it has restricted tokens, job objects, desktop object, and the integrity level. So then how exhaustive is the OS-based confinement according to the documentation? So as per the Chromium documentation, we found that for mounted FAT and FAT32 volumes, there was no protection which was documented. There is no protection for TCP/IP, and then access to most existing securable resources are denied, right? So, and this is fair enough. This should be reasonably good enough to secure and contain and exploit within the sandbox, assuming that the kernel behaves correctly, right? So this is how the Chrome sandbox would work. As you can see, the slave is 2856, and it's trying to access a file, and then it sends an IPC call to the master over a named pipe, which is not visible here because Process Explorer doesn't show you named pipe activity, but it sends a message to the master, which is 2808 PID, and then the master ultimately gives it the handle to basically access the file. So basically the idea is that if you compromise the master, it's game over, because master is the one which decides all of the activity of the sandbox. So so far, most of the research which you have seen has to break the Chrome sandbox has been to break the master, right? And there has been a lot of research, a lot of exploits have been written for that. And our question is, how resistant is the operating system to a malicious slave? And then we actually focus on this aspect wherein we assume that if we can compromise the slave, leveraging a OS vulnerability, can the sandbox stand ground? So in case of Adobe Reader, you can observe that it has low integrity level. This is how it looks in terms of the security properties for the sandbox. And it denies you access to all the key resources. And there has been a lot of work done in terms of breaking the master. And in fact, recently there was an exploit found in the wild which broke or breached the Adobe Reader sandbox, and it leveraged a bug in the master, and it was like just last month. So the question is, are kernel vulnerabilities exploitable from within the Adobe Reader sandbox? And then similarly, the Chrome browser, which is based on the principles of Chromium, both Reader and Chrome browser, has slightly different implementation than Adobe Reader. So, for example, you will see the untrusted integrity level is the least privileged level, as opposed to Adobe Reader X, where it's only low. Similarly, we found that the access to FAT32 file system is denied in Chrome, in the Chrome browser, which is kind of interesting because it's not documented in the publicly available Chromium resources. So obviously the Google security team spent extra time and effort adding these additional features there. So and we know about the Podium contest, the Pawn to Own contest, where there have been successful attacks against the master. And as we saw that each of these attacks were very complex and non-trivial to exploit, because fundamentally by design, the master is a much smaller code base, but the slave is a much larger code base, because slave does all the rendering and the processing. And the idea is that to keep the master code base small enough so that it has a lower attack surface, and hence it gets more and more difficult to attack the master. And as we have seen, people have jumped through like several chains of exploits to break through the Chrome sandbox. So, however, if the slave can exploit a kernel vulnerability in the Chrome browser, they have done some due diligence there as well. Like, for example, it still denies access, for example, if you need to create a process and if you need to alter certain changes in the registry, for example. And the Adobe Reader X, the Adobe Reader Sandbox, is not so tight. It is far more lax in, like, for example, registry control and so on. However, for the Chrome browser, win32k.sys is pretty much fully exposed, which means that it's a huge attack surface. And a vulnerability there can pretty much exploit and break out of the Chrome sandbox, and without the need to achieve the ability to break through the master at all. So now let's try out our demo as Rafal spins the roulette and see how Chrome Sandbox and Adobe Sandbox stand to our exploits.
So another day, another vulnerability. This time it will be the vulnerability related to Truetype font parsing, fixed in Microsoft Bulletin 1275. So not that long time ago, about a half year ago. And this will be a little bit different than the other exploits for a couple of reasons. First of all, we will not start with compromising the slave. This exploit does not require compromise the slave at all. It's enough to just open a crafted web page in a vulnerable version of the Chrome browser running on a vulnerable Windows version, and then you get memory corruption in the kernel context. And what we will show in a while, it will result in blue screen of death. So you won't get code execution, but it will be enough to, I guess, to convince you that it's possible to corrupt kernel memory. And everyone agrees who analyzes this vulnerability that it's possible to achieve code execution, so constructive exploit. It's doable using this vulnerability, and it's much helpful if an attacker gets the ability to run arbitrary code in the slave first, in the renderer first. The reason is that then you have much more control over, for instance, the layout of the memory used by the kernel. You can do heap spraying of the kernel in a reliable manner, etc., etc. So again, to sum up, this vulnerability is exploitable to get code execution, to get a full bypass of the sandbox, but what we'll show you in a moment is just a crash of the Windows kernel to prove that this vulnerability exists. And can be exploited at the browser level. Okay. So we open the browser. We didn't shut down correctly. Interesting. And we open some HTML file from the file system. You see, this is a file // URL, but it can be hosted on any website. So clicking on random link is safe or not? We can try to find out, and to click the link, and the effect is machine panics, right? And you can see at the top of the screen, you see Win32k. This is the culprit. Yeah. So it's no longer needed. Okay. We have already said that. If you run this exploit with debugger attached, you can get a stack backtrace, and you see that the functions related to TTF font handling are in a stack trace. Okay, but I guess you're not too excited with crashes. So another day, another vulnerability, and this is gonna be the famous vulnerability exploited by the Doku, fixed in Microsoft Bulletin 1187. And again, it's related to Truetype font parsing. Again, it was exploited in the wild by the real malware, and it was distributed by Microsoft Office documents. Could we run the same exploit in the context of the Chrome Sandbox? Would it work? Would the sandbox, because of its limited privilege, may turn out to be impossible to run such an exploit within a sandbox? So let's have a look. Here. Okay. So now a few words about methodology. It's important to understand what's going on. So if we would like to show you a full exploit, so it would again consist of two parts. First, compromising the renderer, compromising the slave. So you would provide some crafted HTML page, which would, for instance, reference some crafted data structures like vector markup language, whatever data structure that is parsed by the slave. And if we open this HTML page in the Chrome browser, then the slave would get compromised, right? Because most of the input that you pass to the web page via the web page is parsed by the slave. And then once we get code execution in the slave, we are already present on the operating system, and then we can run the exploit against the operating system. So that's not going to happen today. We didn't want to waste time on developing exploit against the slave. The reason being that the whole purpose why you run the sandbox is that you expect that the slave can be compromised, can be exploited, and this is the sole reason of having the sandbox. So we assume that, again, exploits against the renderer are not that interesting. So we focus only on the second part that was supposed to be much more difficult. Once you run code in the context of the renderer, in the slave, how can you escape out to get full control of the system? And that's exactly what we're going to show you now. So what we will do, maybe let's start with Adobe Reader first. So we just open some dummy PDF file. It's, the contents is totally irrelevant. We open it only for one reason, to get the renderer running. So if you run Process Explorer and look at the process hierarchy, okay, so the second one is the slave, the renderer process. If you have a look at it, of course it runs as ordinary user, and if you look at the security tab, you can see all these details on the restricted tokens, etc., etc. So it looks like it's supposed to be, and the PID is 3760. 3760. So what we'll do now, we will simulate the first stage of a real full exploit. So instead of running, passing some complex malformed data structures to the slave, we'll just inject code into it directly by opening the process and writing the process memory. So it won't be a very typical DLL injection, because DLL injection in its vanilla form does not work at all against Chrome browser, for instance, but something close to. So first we'll inject the library that is responsible for handling EOT format that embeds the Truetype font, and then the exploit itself. Okay, so again, this command injects code into the slave. We have noted that 3760 is the slave, not the master. So this command just simulates running the exploit within the context of the slave. Okay, so what's gonna happen? We have a calculator. And usually calculator means that exploit worked properly. And now let's have a look at the process hierarchy. You see that calculator was started by the master, the parent process. Again, we messed only with the injected code into the slave, and somehow master was persuaded to start a calculator. And it was possible because, again, if you look at the slave now, you see the user it runs as anti-authority system. So this exploit that we have injected resulted in the slave running as anti-authority system. It totally broke out of the restrictions imposed by the sandbox. So again, to sum up, that demonstrates the total bypass of the Adobe Reader sandbox once you have code execution in the slave. Once you get code execution in the sandbox, by using the underlying kernel vulnerability, you can totally break out of the system, of the sandbox. You can run arbitrary programs, manipulate any processes. And again, the beauty of this approach is that again, exactly the same exploit code will work against Chrome browser. The only thing that we should do is because the side effect of running this exploit is that it installs a permanent backdoor, so let's remove it. Yeah, so you see that one of the processor was infected. Now it's clean. Okay, so that's again a clean state. So again, we'll do very similar actions this time with Google Chrome. We'll open some totally dummy page. again, it has no malicious content in it. Again, the whole purpose of running this is to get a renderer process running. Let's see what's the process ID of the renderer. Yeah, it's 2348. And again, same. It runs as normal user. In the security tab, you can see that it has a restricted token, untrusted integrity, etc., etc. So everything is normal. 2348. And now again, using exactly the same exploit, 2348. Again, we inject the code into the slave. So our exploit again will be executed in the context of the slave, in the sandbox process. And again, sometimes you have to run it more than once. Again, we have a calculator, which again usually means everything is fine. And if you look at the process hierarchy again, it's very similar to what we have seen before. Calculator was started by the master process. Again, something unusual. And again, the reason is the renderer Chrome process runs as system. So again, the slave sandbox process was able to execute a kernel exploit vulnerability, get the highest possible privilege in user mode, and then it could instruct the master process to do anything it wants. So again, it demonstrates the total compromise of the sandbox implemented in Chrome browser. Again, assuming that you can get initial code execution in a sandbox environment. Okay. So now I think that's about it about constructive exploits. Okay, we have some more time. I think, yeah, that we have already discussed. These are the screenshots of renderers, slaves running as system. And the final demonstration that you will see, because the two presentations were focused on Truetype vulnerabilities, so again you don't get impression that the graphics subsystem is the only layer of code that is exposed to the attacks. Let's have a look at another vulnerability, this time fixed in Microsoft Bulletin 1198. And it was titled Windows Kernel Exception Handler Vulnerability, which frankly doesn't make sense. Again, the vulnerability is in the core of the operating system. This time it was related to handling local descriptor table entries. So this will be the final example. So, and again, let's try to play with Acrobat Reader this time, so you don't have an impression that it's something not applicable to Acrobat Reader. Okay, this is vulnerability, and we will need the process ID. Process ID of the renderer as usual. Okay, so this time the renderer is 1004. So again, what we do, we inject code in the 1004, right? In the context of the sandbox. The exploit is run in the context of the sandbox process. And this is a real exploit that exploits this vulnerability. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how to exploit it for code execution. I'm not even sure it's exploitable. I would need much more time for development. But again, you will have a look at the result. The result of running this crude version of an exploit is that if you run it in the context of the renderer, again, you see the crash. So again, it proves the existence of the vulnerability and that it can be reached from within the sandbox. Okay, I think that's about it.
So basically we demonstrated bypassing all the common sandboxes, and as I had mentioned in my first slide, we didn't factor or take into account one of the very widely used sandboxes. Any idea which I was talking about? It's probably Java. So Java is also a sandbox. We decided to exclude it from this talk because I guess it's pretty widely exploited all the time. You can just go to probably malwaredomains.com for the latest security updates on Java, I guess. So, but yeah, to come to the point of the talk, the final points. Many Windows kernel vulnerabilities have been discovered, and this has been an interesting trend in the past few years, and many more are expected to come because it's a huge attack surface, and there's a lot of new interesting development happening in the exploitation scene of kernel vulnerabilities, as we can see. So if a sandbox relies on kernel security, a suitable kernel vulnerability can be used to completely bypass the sandbox. And in fact, last week in the CanSec West Podium contest, Pon2Own contest, apparently one kernel OS vulnerability was used to breach the Chrome browser. So it's kind of something which we are likely to see more and more often going forward. And a final slide is there are alternatives to do more reliable sandboxing, and virtualization-based sandbox is one good option, because what it does is that it wraps the whole operating system inside a sandbox, which means that OS vulnerabilities like these are going to be non-fatal. But do not forget that the hypervisor and all the supporting environments are still an attack surface, and for that you need to have a customized hypervisor to limit the exposure. And still we feel that the amount of functionality exposed by a hardened hypervisor is still much lesser than that of a sandbox which is relying on the OS kernel to make its decisions, basically. So yeah, I guess that's all we had to share, and we are open for questions now. Yeah.
So basically, when you're saying that reducing the attack surface and having a hypervisor or even the master-slave model of a Chrome browser, of an Acrobat Reader, there the attack surface is so low, so small, and it's much more difficult to actually break out through the normal mechanisms without attacking the kernel. Isn't then the real solution not to work around this kind of, well, non-working operating system, but rather, in the future, make sure that the operating system attack surface to the kernel is much lower? I mean, if we could do the same thing, if the operating system would allow us to specify for a renderer, for example, that the attack surface, the kernel exposure is much lower. Maybe only the renderer can only write to a pipe. Or it can never write it to a file, it can never read the registry, it can never load a font. The only thing that we allow the renderer to do is to write to a pipe, maybe open a socket or something. Wouldn't that fix the problem instead of patching a hypervisor around and working around the broken OS?
Yeah, I think the fundamental point we are talking about is the attack surface, fundamentally, as you said, right? So hypervisor is one way of doing it, but ultimately it's going to be non-trivial to make sure that the exposure to the kernel interfaces is contained, because it's a very wide attack surface. It's the win32.sys, it's the memory manager. There's so many aspects about the kernel which are going to be always vulnerable, right? So, say from a browser, a Chrome point of view, you could limit the renderer access, but say from a sandboxy, a more generic sandbox, is going to be very difficult.
Yeah, Microsoft needs to work on that.
So Microsoft, I mean, if Microsoft works on that, I guess this would just make a secure operating system first.
So just as an example, on Linux, there are efforts to have the seccomp mode, for example, and seccomp filter. We can essentially say for a child process, you can say, or in the process to specify that, you can say, this is only allowed to have the following syscalls available. So the kernel is the same, but it can only do this and that.
Whitelisted, yeah.
Right? So that's basically
we even mentioned this BPF filtering in the white paper with it.
Okay. Yeah, second filter. Yeah.
It's a good. It's a very sane approach to explicitly limit the exposure. But you can do it on Linux. But what to do on Windows?
Yeah, that's true.
First, you would have to rip out all the graphics of the kernel, because on Windows, the slaves must be able to use the graphics, right? And it means it must access all these kernel interfaces that deal with the graphics. And this is an inherent problem, right? Yeah. On Linux, it looks much better because, again, the graphics is in different layers, so that's much better. And generally, for instance, from the security posture, Linux kernel had a lot of problems with kernel vulnerabilities like 7 years ago in 2006. But they probably did their homework, and the problem is not that prevalent at the moment. Although, by itself, Linux kernel is also very large, monolithic, and exposes a lot of interfaces. But at least from the point of view how many vulnerabilities are reported, it looks much better, right? So if we can all move to a different, more secure operating system, that would be a great solution. But it's not doing it right.
Doesn't Enhancement supervisory mode execution prevention reduce the attack surface? After all, it blocks.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Sorry.
Doesn't Enhancement technology supervisory mode execution prevention reduce the attack surface? After all, it blocks code execution from user mode page in ring 0.
You're talking about the Intel? SMEP. Yeah, SMEP. So yeah, SMEP has come, I think in Windows 8 is adopting SMEP. Yeah, I think Intel Ivy Bridge processors onwards, they support SMEP. Yes, that is a good kernel mode anti-exploitation, but we already know that there are ways like kernel mode ROP mechanism to bypass SMEP. Fundamentally, the issue is that if you have an anti-exploitation technology like MET or SMEP, it's focused on the exploitation vector. So if a new exploitation vector emerges, it can bypass that technology. So it's definitely a good step, because as of now on Windows 7 there's very limited kernel mode security for an anti-exploitation, but it's definitely a good step. I would say a good foot for Microsoft in the right direction.
Now it's SMEP?
Yes.
There's another one coming named SMAP. So it introduces even tighter control on how kernel can interact with user memory. And it will be really killer if it's implemented, but maybe in Windows 9 or Windows 10.
You mentioned that on the VM and hypervisor, that Ardent hypervisor should limit the impact of those attacks. Did you experiment on basic VMware or VirtualBox setup on workstations?
Right. Yeah. So these attacks, the attacks which we are talking about, the kernel, which are kind of getting more prevalent, this can be prevented in a hypervisor-based solution like a VM, because we have basically the whole OS wrapped inside the sandbox, which is the VM. So even if the kernel exploits it, you have a new VM session, and the host won't die basically. So yes, we have tested several. So basically, the only way to bypass that would be to actually bypass the hypervisor, which is and the attack surface for the hypervisor is much smaller than that of the OS kernel, for instance. If it is a good, well-written hypervisor, not the generally available hypervisor, I would say.
Why do you think that Microsoft ever decided to do font parsing?
That's a very good question.
Is it like too slow to do user space? Like
I think probably it was to do with performance, is what I suspect. But it just baffles why would you do font parsing in the kernel, because it's a architectural blunder, I would say, and it's a huge hole and a huge attack surface, which is just. It's going to be, and TTF font has been, something about, people have been talking about it for so many years now. It's not something new, right? But I believe that the early versions of Windows NT, I think they did not have it implemented in the kernel, is what I believe.
I think Windows 3.51 had graphics in user mode, but it was too slow. So the main reason to move to kernel mode was to improve performance, and there are some very funny remarks from kernel from Microsoft engineer that moving the graphics subsystem to the kernel improves performance, but does not affect stability nor security.
Okay, that's all then. Thank you very much.